Right, starting. Okay, I have Tyler Alterman here, who's deeply immersed in the effective altruism movement. And so we're going to be talking about a number of topics relating to effective altruism, covering the basics of what is EA. We'll be talking about why do the most good, cause prioritization, effective career choice, conferences like the Effective Altruism Global and the New X, EAGX conferences, and general EA outreach. We might cover topics like Pareto Fellowship and all that sort of thing as well. So, yes, as I mentioned, Tyler Alterman is heavily immersed in the effective altruism movement there in San Francisco. I believe you're in at the moment. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Used to be part of the Center for Effective Altruism, or still is, but doing a number of other things as well. Do you want to give us a rundown of what you're doing?
Sure. So my primary role is that I'm the Director of Growth at the Center for Effective Altruism, which is a think tank based at Oxford University. But sub-roles within that include I am the President of Effective Altruism Global, which is a yearly conference series based around the question of how to do the most good, and it's sort of the summit of the effective altruism movement. I'm a partner at Effective Altruism Ventures, which is a funding network of people interested in high-risk, high-reward new ventures that stand to improve human flourishing to a large degree. And there's one other thing I do. Oh yeah, I'm the co-director of the Pareto Fellowship, which is a fellowship for people who want to accomplish massive amounts of good and just need the resources and the training and the network to do so.
Fantastic. Yes, well, I'm looking forward to questioning you about that one.
Sure.
Yes, but first of all, for viewers who aren't yet initialized into, like, who don't yet know about the EA movement or what it is for, what it does, when you tell people about the EA movement, what do you normally tell them? Like,
sure.
If they haven't really heard too much about it yet.
Yeah, so first I usually just tell them the sort of one-line elevator description, which is that effective altruism is a social and intellectual movement that uses reason and evidence to improve the world as much as possible. And so it's sort of it's like a scientific take on how to get the most out of every dollar and every effort that you want to try to put into improving universal flourishing or whatever your metric is of good. And the process, so it's unusual in terms of a social and intellectual movement in that it's much more like something like the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution rather than, say, the climate change movement or the anti-HIV movement. And the reason is that it's much more based around a process. So similar to science isn't actually just a bunch of facts, and it's not an end. It's rather a process by which you continue improving your state of knowledge. And similarly, effective altruism is this process of first trying to figure out how do I do the most good, and then that's step one, and then step two is doing it.
Okay, cool. Right. So, what are some common misconceptions then about it, the effective altruism movement that sometimes come up?
Yeah, so I think
what are people confused about?
Sure. I think it's easy to get confused about something like effective altruism, especially because it is a process-based movement, right? So if you say I'm part of the anti-climate change movement, it's clear exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to make climate change not an existential catastrophe or not a catastrophic risk. With effective altruism, it's of course much more unclear, right? Because first it depends on what is your definition of good, and then it depends on what does the research say is the most effective way to accomplish that at any given time. So I think one of the most common confusions about effective altruism is that it is such a process-based movement, that first and foremost, one of the most important things about being part of the movement is engaging in this intellectual process of wrestling over the question of what is good and how do I do the most good. And so I think that's a major stumbling block because there's no other movement I can think of where it's like, okay, now you're in the gate, read these 20 papers and like try to understand these 50 considerations, put it all together, and then see what answer that yields. Most movements try to equip you with exactly what you're supposed to do. Like, you know, if you go to the Mormon church, it's clear what you do. You go to church every week. Maybe occasionally you go to a barbecue. You like read the Mormon version of scripture, etc. And that's certainly not the case for effective altruism. Yeah, so I'd say that's one of the biggest confusions. But there are others that I could talk about if you want.
Yeah. So I mean, like, it's interesting. Like, people do have different conceptions of what's good. Some people think the idea of what's good is particularly it's centralized upon. It's very situated. So there's like, you can say moral relativism is a form of that. But is there? Well, let's talk about your personal view on what is good.
Sure.
Are you coming from maybe an objective, moral realist point of view about what's good, or a moral relativist, or do those philosophical concerns not, you don't listen to those, or is there something else?
No, I think effective altruism is one of the very few movements where the philosophical concerns really make a huge difference for the types of things you end up doing. In some cases they don't. So, for example, like you mentioned, there are moral realists who believe that morality might be this objective phenomena that you can discover, and there are moral non-realists who believe that maybe morality is something like mind relative, or there's no objective morality; it's all in the head. Then you can go even further with a sort of moral non-realist relativist stance that says that morality is different for all different sorts of people. However, I would say that it's possible for all these different points of view both to come together and to split apart. Personally, I'm confused about this, as one should be, because 2,000 years of ethical philosophy or more still have not yielded clear answers. So I think if you're not confused about morality, then something is wrong with your process. But so my tentative commitment is something like to believe that there is not an objective morality, but rather there's a lot of intersubjectivity with regards to morality. So it seems that most people, when you boil down their sense of morality, converge on certain things that it is just obviously good to do. So it seems like it is obviously good in most forms of morality not to cause harm, for the most part, if you can avoid it. It is obviously good in most forms of morality to like better other people around you, to as well not engage in behaviors that maybe indirectly cause harm. So basically, my own viewpoint relies on a lot of moral convergence between lots of different frameworks, but then probably more importantly, B, that I just want to improve the lives of other humans, and I would say that's even more important, to be honest.
Cool. Well, I mean, it seems as though, according to a lot of scholars, there has been moral progress, and Peter Singer spoke about the expanding circle there of ethical consideration. And was that part of animal liberation that maybe he addressed that, or around that time? And then Steven Pinker, who I believe you know, also expanded upon the idea in the Better Angels of His Nature. Now they have reasons for this. Why they think that there's been moral progress, why the world isn't as violent, or there isn't as much cruelty based on population levels. Percentage of population levels, there's not as much cruelty per 1% or whatever. Why do you think this is the case? What's been the reason for this moral progress?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't have a super good theory, and I know there are a number of them. So I know some people believe that it's a matter of sort of the march of scientific values and like secular values. Some people believe that it's a much more interconnected world, so it's much harder to indirectly cause harm and not be aware of the harm that's being indirectly caused sometimes. I don't entirely buy that argument or the previous one. So, I mean, long story short, I don't have enough evidence to say one way or the other what's responsible, but I'm glad it's happening. at least within it. So it does seem that moral progress has been made, at least within a certain framework, which is probably the utilitarian or consequentialist framework, which I probably most approximate in terms of my morality. Sorry for the non-answer.
That's an answer. I mean, you don't have to have like an answer which, you know, ticks, or just, you know, like that can be sort of validated. You can have an opinion, and I think that's completely fine. Now, yeah, so utilitarian frameworks are particularly interesting to me. I mean, I consider myself a somebody who aspires to utilitarianism, but on the ground I often find myself just, you know, in a very human way doing something maybe similar to what a virtue ethics might appear to if somebody were like a caveman or something like that. How much theory behind them? Okay, so but I mean, it's a good thing to act on theory and to really look at how actions have consequences, and instead of just trying to embody exactly what has been considered as virtuous in the past, look for new ways to do the most good and do good better than has been done before. I find that quite interesting. Yeah,
totally. And you know, it's possible to combine something like virtue ethics with utilitarianism, which is also more what I do. Like I don't trust my current state of knowledge to make perfectly the right utilitarian calculation of pleasure over pain when I, you know, buy a bean burrito versus like call my mom or something with the same amount of time. You know, it could be that my pleasure is greater if I like enough to account for both my pleasure and my mom by eating a bean burrito if I really like a bean burrito. But since I don't trust that sort of judgment on an act by act basis, I too adhere to something sort of like virtue ethics, which is that I try to figure out what are some things that maximize the amount of happiness over suffering or pain in general, and then try to follow those rules as much as possible.
Fantastic.
And I think a lot of people do that in practice because we're not calculating robots, at least yet.
Yes, at least yet. And sure, we can talk about like uploading and becoming cyborgs and merging with machines and the singularity and the intelligence explosion and like, utilitarian shockwaves and trying to like develop civilizations on the skin of a black hole or something like that. So what I mean, like, at least at the time being, before we actually, you know, achieve like or, you know, try and inherit our cosmic endowment, what can we do the most today?
Yeah. So again, first of all, it depends on your value framework. So if your ideal is to, I have many suggestions for you. If your ideal is to try to maximize something like universal flourishing for all sentient beings, or try to maximize utility for as many sentient observers as possible or something. I have fewer suggestions if your ideal is something like maximize complexity or some other possible moral value, like maximize beauty, regardless of whether that beauty is perceived by an observer. Like, I think there are many moral frameworks you can take to effective altruism where it's possible to do the most good within that framework. But I think in practice, effective altruists tend to care about like how many lives can we save and improve as the standard, like sort of common sense metrics. And I think that agrees with most people's sense of like sort of what morality actually is in the first place, with many notable exceptions. But so within that framework of trying to like save and improve the most lives, there's this, I think the most important principle is something like strategic cause selection, which is also called variously cause neutrality or cause prioritization. And that's basically the idea that if you really care about doing the most good, you should try to stay relatively neutral as to what specific cause or what specific way you use to do the most good. And the reason is that our state of knowledge is continuously improving. So we're continuously finding new ways to do more good than we ever thought possible than before, A. And then also B, if you do care about just lives in general or beings and sentient beings in general, then you shouldn't really have a preference for one cause over the other unless that cause is better for maximizing the well-being or preferences or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that long-winded introduction,
That's fine.
I would say, yeah. So engaging in cause prioritization seems like the number one way to try to attempt to do the most good. And the reason for that is very simple. It's something that I think most people can understand if they've ever been acquainted with like standard business logic. So my favorite analogy for cause prioritization is probably I don't know what the name would be for it in business speak, but I call it something like vertical selection. So when you want to make lots and lots of money, one of the most important choices you can make isn't your exact business plan and isn't the exact particulars of your implementation of a business plan, but rather what industry you select to go into or what vertical you choose. So, for example, if you want to make $1 billion, it just doesn't really make a ton of sense for you to go into restauranteering. You know, there are a number of notable cases of people making billions in restauranteering, but those cases are relatively few compared to the amount of cases of people making over $1 billion if you go into, say, software entrepreneurship. So you have by now probably dozens of software companies that have or maybe much more than dozens that have valuations over $1 billion, and relatively few restaurants that have become global chains. So likewise, if you care about saving and improving 1 billion lives, it doesn't make sense for you to choose some causes over another if that's the thing you really care about. There could be other reasons that you choose one cause over another, such as like you enjoy that cause more. But if you're really trying to save and improve lives, it doesn't make as much sense. So an example of, I think, really positive causes that you probably wouldn't choose if you wanted to save and improve 1 billion lives are things like, maybe something like a local soup kitchen, which certainly does quite a lot of good. But if you have the potential to be doing something else that is saving and improving many more lives, then you probably should select something else over the soup kitchen. And so that's like the first analogy to introduce cost prioritization, which is like business vertical selection. But I can go into much more in-depth heuristics for how to choose a cause if you think that would be useful.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like cause prioritization is one of the key principles of effective altruism I find stands out. And so if you're cause agnostic, neutral, or you want to sort of maximize your selection criteria as to which causes you want to donate to, then you should come into this thinking you know everything about what causes should have a choosing causes based on a rule of thumb sort of mindset. Now you can also offload your cause prioritization choices onto an organization that spends a lot of time researching this.
Sure.
And that's another strategy it's worth mentioning. But yes, please, do go into more detail here. I find this very interesting.
Sure. So for the thing you just mentioned, it's possible to do a lot of personal work on cause prioritization. It's also possible to choose one of the few organizations that's available that already does this really, really in depth and rely on them. And so I think that's a good strategy for people who are limited in how much time or how much effort they can dedicate to effective altruism. And so those organizations are GiveWell, which is an incredible charity evaluation machine that does puts tons and tons of hours into trying to figure out how can we save and improve the most lives, largely in the domain of things that are more easily quantifiable and where the outcomes are more clear. So things like global poverty and global health. But then they also have a branch called the Open Philanthropy Project, which is less interested in things that are easily quantifiable and more interested in the question of if we were able to accomplish this thing, how much good would it actually do? And so you might be able to get rough orders of magnitude estimates of how much good various causes will do, but it's not the sort of thing as it's not the same sort of thing as GiveWell, where you get the satisfaction of saving a life for exactly roughly ballpark some amount of money. Personally, I think the Open Philanthropy Project approach is probably the superior one to GiveWell, because what you should be trying to maximize ideally is expected value. So the amount of good you could possibly do multiplied by the probability you can actually make it happen. So you should, if you have an opportunity to take on something that could accomplish an amazing amount of good, but there's a relatively small possibility, it could be that the expected value of that is still much higher than something where you get a sure gain of lives saved and improved. But maybe that's a more technical discussion than is worth going into. So I would say rules of thumb for cause prioritization, though, if you want to try it yourself, and I recommend the exercise because I think it's a profound exercise, is to try to shoot or try to keep three things in mind. And this is hugely simplifying the literature. I should say that there's now a massive amount of work that's been done on cause prioritization, and this is basically just the three things to think about if you're not going to read dozens of things. So the three metrics, which both GiveWell and Open Philanthropy Project use, are tractability, scale, and neglectedness. And let's see, there's this whiteboard, portable whiteboard over here that's just lying around. So I want to see if
fantastic.
let me see if this marker works. Kind of. All right, I'll try it out. So I think that the framework is best illustrated with you, like visually. So it might be reversed by video, but I'll try to keep that in mind.
I'm sure people can. Yeah. Sorry, as long as you can write backwards. Yes, that's a graph. The beginnings of a graph. Yes, X and Y.
All right, I'll do it in reverse. Cool. So X and Y axes. Don't mind the smudge over here. So let's say.
Well, actually, the way I'm seeing it is back to front now. I think Google must have automatically switched it. Anyway,
oh, amazing.
Cool. I mean, So what you can see. So if you just write one word up the top, and I'll see what I see.
Cool. I'll write the word hello.
It's appearing the right way to me. It's
amazing.
The right way around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Google. Cool. So on the y-axis, for all these graphs, I'll do something like impact and expectation, like the amount of impact you can expect to get using this heuristic. And then on the x-axis, I'll do the three different things: tractability, scale, and neglectedness. So let's see. I use I for impact, and then T for tractability. So all else equal, you want to try to take on causes and projects where the effort that you put in is rewarded with much more output than other causes. So if a cause if it's really hard to make a difference in the cause, like something, it would be amazing if we invented like a perpetual motion machine. But unfortunately, the tractability of that is really poor. However, it is extremely tractable to save lives from malaria. There's some evidence from GiveWell that you can put in roughly $3,000 and expect to save a life with that amount of money, which is pretty incredible. So all else equal, you should try to find things over here. So the things that are easiest to make progress on will yield all else equal much more impact. So that's number one. I should mention that this is non-obvious because I think a lot of people who want to do a lot of good tend to take on careers and projects where the chance of success of making progress in that career is extremely low. These include things like politics often, but I don't want to discourage going into politics because if you do in fact have the ability, then that of course increases the tractability. So the more you're able to make a difference, tractability is a matter of both the environment constraining your action, but then also your level of skill, I should mention. So that's number one. Number two, neglectedness. I'll use N, or actually, let me, instead of neglectedness, I think neglectedness is best framed as something like amount of resource investment versus how much impact you can expect to have. So I'll use resource investments as an R here. And all else equal, you should expect that causes that already have a lot of resource investment in them are not going to be as impacted by your individual efforts. So this is one reason why a lot of people in effective altruism, even though they believe that something like climate change is one of the most important causes in general, tend not to go into climate change just because there are so many extremely talented people taking that cause on. Whereas most EAs will try, I'll use EAs as an abbreviation for effective altruists. Most EAs will try to find things around here toward the bottom where there is relatively little resource investment, making that cause extremely neglected. And as a result, individual efforts can make much more of a difference. So a lot of these causes will be pretty weird, or just ones that for one reason or another haven't gotten a lot of attention yet. So that's neglectedness. And then the final one, which I think is probably the most important out of all of them, is scale. So I'll use S for scale. And the definition of scale is something like, a problem with a lot of scale is a problem where if you put work into that, you would be impacting either many lives, or you would be impacting lives in an incredibly deep way. So all else equal, you should try to prefer things in this upper quadrant. But the thing that's not intuitive about scale is that it looks something like a power law, where there are some causes that have a much higher, like a much greater degree of scale than others. So maybe something like free hugs would be pretty low. So I'd put that probably right here. So while you may be able to create an incredible network of hundreds of thousands of people giving free hugs, even if you could do that, and that would be challenging, even if you could do that, the impact per hug is, or the depth of impact for each hug is relatively low. So someone might feel good for the rest of the day, or good for a few minutes, or worst case scenario, bad, because some stranger just ran up and gave them a hug in the middle of the street. So I would say free hugs is something that is an example of having like being low in terms of scale. Whereas maybe something like soup kitchens, which I mentioned earlier, would probably be much higher than free hugs, but still not at the peak. But then you have things like saving lives from malaria, which is going to be much higher, not just like a little bit higher, but much higher probably than something like soup kitchens, or maybe something like, while I appreciate her intention, Lindsay Lohan's recent attempt or recent suggestion that we should try buying $1,000 Hermes blankets so that homeless people can be warm in luxury. Well, I don't think that's like if we were incredibly rich otherwise, and there weren't so many important causes, I would support that effort. But given that a Hermes blanket is about $1,000, you can literally save a life for 3 Hermes blankets. So I would say probably saving life is orders of magnitude more important than making someone warm and luxurious for a few nights. So it's probably, you probably have something like the blankets thing being here, and then maybe malaria being up here. And then there are arguments, depending on your philosophical views, that there might be things that are way up there, like outside of the frame of this whiteboard. So it depends on how comfortable you are with risk and uncertainty, as well as your philosophical views. But there are many effective altruists who would argue that given that we might have the ability to impact trillions of future lives with the actions that we take now, then we should prioritize far future causes. And the idea behind that is that we probably have the Earth for about 1 billion more years. And then even beyond the Earth, we can expect to start colonizing other stars, possibly even within our lifetime. And so given that the potential future size of humanity might be in the trillions, and there are some actions that we can take now that might make those trillions of future lives much more positive or even exist in the first place. So there's this concept of existential risks, which is the idea of trying to prevent human extinction such that you can enable trillions of future people to live. And so if you buy into certain philosophical arguments, then many EAs would prioritize that at the top. But if you don't buy into those philosophical arguments, then you might prioritize something else like global poverty, global health or animal welfare or something else where similarly you can impact very, very, very many lives than you could otherwise. Whew.
Yes, it's fantastic rundown. And that is a really, really, I like the whiteboard, by the way. I hardly have anybody during an interview pull out a whiteboard, and I think it's awesome.
Sorry, I kind of feel like Carrot Top.
No, that's fine. Look, you know what I mean? Like, imagine like having a street directory that was pure text. Right?
Good point.
Imagine, yeah, okay, so, now you've got to turn left like 250 meters after getting onto Bersel Street, and there's a roundabout, and make sure you get off of the third exit. It would just take so long for people to actually get anywhere, and there would probably be a lot of confusion. It'd be very hard.
Much in favor of making, any attempts to make knowledge much more intuitive, I think, is earns its support from me.
And so the intuition there is key, because diagrams are amazing. I mean, you can look at a street directory and you can see exactly where you need to go. You look at a map and it gives you the right sort of topological landscape. You can see, well, okay, how to get from A to B, very easy. And I think the same can go for like trying to discuss complex issues, including philosophical arguments. And that's why I'm in favor of people doing a bit more research or putting a bit more effort into, although I need to do this a lot more myself, argument maps, decision maps, and some people argue for Bayesian networks because they deal with probability as well, whereas argument maps need to be sort of augmented in order to do that. So that's fantastic. Like, what you're doing is amazing, and keep it up. So
thanks.
Now people.
By the way, for anyone interested in a visualization of cause prioritization, that's probably better than anyone I've ever seen. There's, I forget exactly what it's called. It's something like How to Help the World. But if you go on the Global Priorities Project website, just Google Global Priorities Project, you should be able to find it. It's this amazing decision tree of which cause you might prioritize given various empirical and ethical judgments.
Found it. Okay, that's cool. I'll post that in the description there. Great. Fantastic. Yeah, cool. How can we help the world? There it is. It's a pretty cool decision tree. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, so if people want to feel good about what they're doing, and the way that they can feel good is by getting immediate feedback, but also want to donate to things that might have a huge impact in the far future, I guess they can diversify a portfolio of giving, in a sense. It's still an approach that people take when they're making financial investments for their own benefit too. Is there any strategies there that you've seen or heard about, or that you might do yourself that might be able to help people, diversify their portfolio and feel good about giving, while also giving impactfully, possibly?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's odd, but I don't think you actually see very many people. At least there are not very many people I know who diversify their portfolio, and I think the reason is that if you're philosophically committed to the far future, most people that I know who hold this philosophical point of view are also very much on board in terms of like what their gut feels, or what they intuitively feel. Like they can visualize the many future human lives, and they've even done like thought experiments to help them grok that, so to speak. But I think even the people who haven't done that do find that there is a nice feedback loop with some far future stuff, in terms of when you start donating to an EA organization, many of them are incredibly transparent in terms of the updates that they give their funders. So you can see their milestones in terms of their progress. A lot of them will even mention their mistakes. In fact, on givewell.com, there's a tab that is called Mistakes, with all the things that they've done wrong. I find this to be an incredible phenomenon that you don't see in other movements, maybe for good reason. But yeah, I think for a lot of far future people who want instantaneous feedback, I haven't seen too much of a problem, given that you have these organizational updates, and then also given that there's this incredible community of people So often, if you're part of the far future crowd, you'll tend to know lots of people by first name just because there are so few people working on it. And so you actually get the gratification of when you donate to a far future organization, probably someone who you have hung out with before telling you thank you so much. And that's often enough to get the right amount of maybe you might say warm fuzzies. But that said, I don't think it's an irrational strategy to donate to both something like the Against Malaria Foundation or give directly, where you can directly just send dollars to people who are in the worst kinds of poverty. And then also, like, while doing that on the side, donate the bulk of your money to a far future cause, or vice versa. Let's say you care about the future of humanity only a little bit, and you're very motivated to do that, but you think it's more important to affect people in the present. Then I don't think it's irrational to have a mixed portfolio. In the same way that, even though I don't think eating chocolate is the best thing for me to do right before this interview, I ate a lot of chocolate because it made me feel good.
Yeah.
that might not be the most rational, the most rational thing for if I were a computer or whatever. We're still humans.
That's true.
I love chocolate.
And I do like chocolate too, but I have significantly cut down my chocolate. I'm kind of proud of myself for that.
I'm jealous.
Well, so yeah, I've lost a lot of weight actually this year. I've been doing a lot to sort of manage it.
Nice.
Now, I was going to say, yeah. So when people donate to a cause prioritization or a fund that might allocate their donations to different charities, I mean that's in a sense sort of diversifying. Now I think you can sort of bias your donations when you're giving to these organizations by being specific about what you want to donate to, but giving what we can and the Open Philanthropy Project or Give Well, they'll give different suggestions, but generally would they suggest a portfolio, or if you're agnostic and you don't care exactly where the money goes, you just hope that it does some good, then they may try to diversify that over time.
Yeah, and that's what I would recommend. If you don't care specifically what your money does, but are happy to defer judgments to people who spend hundreds of hours thinking about this sort of thing, I would recommend probably giving money not to a specific thing, but giving Give Well or what have you the liberty to, like you said, spend that money efficiently over time, given that our conception of what is doing the most good is likely to change from decade to decade or even year to year. Although currently something like that doesn't exist for anything other really than global poverty and global health. Although it should soon. We're probably going to come up with something like an EA mutual fund for people who want to spread their money over other causes in an efficient way.
I guess some people believe that even giving to people today will have second order effects of improving the future somehow tomorrow by making the world more productive or raising more rational people in the world without actually directly giving to the Future of Humanity Institute, Mary, the Future of Life Institute, something like that. So even if you do care about the far future, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to give all your money to the far future organizations. I'm a big advocate for far future research and action. I've given to Miri for quite some time, quite a while ago. I helped organize some conferences in Australia to try, with the aim of trying to raise some money there. But I found that some people are a little bit worried about effective altruism because they talk about giving to far future organizations. And so I was listening to the buzz that was going on around the time of the Effective Altruism Global Conference in San Francisco, which was before the one in Melbourne that I helped organize. And people were criticizing it, saying that people are too confident in the future, and some people were worried about certain things that people were saying there, and maybe justifiably, but I wasn't there. I didn't actually hear the conversations firsthand. What's your on the ground perspective here?
So my on the ground perspective is complicated, as you might expect, but it's something like it's really easy I mean, the most natural thing for someone to do is to commit to a cause and then experience something like confirmation bias, where they see new pieces of evidence streaming in that are positive evidence for the thing being important as credible, and they see new pieces of information streaming in that mark the cause as not being important as not credible. And so I think even though effective altruists are some of the most intellectually engaged and clear-headed people I have ever met, I think you probably should, like, given the baseline of confirmation bias just as a background feature in humanity, you should expect a lot of people to really dig their heels into one cause or the other, which is, I think, an unfortunate phenomenon. But I think much more so than I've ever seen, the EA community has been able to change their mind on a movement-wide level. And it's a really incredible thing. Like, you see people inside the EA movement, like, even though there certainly are very many people who get attached to a cause and then stick to that cause for their entire EA career thus far, I think just as many people you see coming in through like animal welfare and then switching over to global poverty, or vice versa, or coming in through global poverty and switching to far future. For example, Neil Bowerman, who's an amazing case, came in with a PhD and an incredible background working in the climate change movement, and he had a fairly high position there. I mean, relative to the amount of people working on the problem, but then he chose to give that up initially to work on more sort of what one might say a meta cause, which is like building the effective altruism movement and doing effective altruism outreach. And then he subsequently changed his mind to believe that the far future is the most important thing that he personally could be doing, like tackling. So he moved from the Center for Effective Altruism to the Future of Humanity Institute. And you'll probably see in the future people like him changing their minds again. And I think that's the sort of thing that is to be encouraged if you want a really strong intellectual community. I think contrary to what a lot of people believe, changing your mind is like an incredible strength rather than a weakness, because it's really, really hard to do when you have an affinity with something to update away from that thing. So I think my take on the issue is that it was probably overemphasized that EAs are overconfident in what causes they choose, because you should expect to see the most confident people also being the most vocal. Whereas the people who are much more unsure about what the most important thing is are probably going to express tentative statements that don't really make a newspaper headline very exciting. And so, if you asked me what the best cause is, what I would probably do is chalk your ear off for 3 hours straight. And that's not something that is easily publishable. So I think EA, it's both true and not true, I would say.
So actually, I did actually skip a question. I didn't actually ask exactly. I said, what can we do to do, or what can we do to do the most good? But I think another fundamental question is why.
Right.
Yeah, why do the most good?
Why do the most good? Yeah, good question. It's a tricky one, but I wrote down 3 things. So the first thing, there's one selfish reason, one sort of, and then 2 other reasons. So the selfish reason is, and I don't in practice see this compelling very many people, even though it's touted quite a bit. But I think the selfish reason is, even if you don't care about doing good from a gut level, there's a lot of evidence that doing good makes you happy, that saving and improving other lives is really good for your personal well-being. And so there's a growing amount of evidence there, if you're selfish, that you should probably be an effective altruist, even if you're not an altruist or even close. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that it seems like doing the most good is consistent with many moral systems that we subscribe to. So a simple argument to illustrate this point is the drowning child thought experiment, which a lot of people will be familiar with, where, I mean, there are a lot of things you can gain from this thought experiment, but I think one thing to gain is the sort of good maximization part of effective altruism, where if you were walking to work in your finest suit or wearing your finest shoes, let's say, or your Hermes blanket, let's say you're covered in your, like, in 3 $1,000 Hermes blankets because you're bringing these to maybe your loved one or something. You have them in a bag, and you walk past a dirty puddle where you find a baby drowning. So the question is, would you feel morally obligated to save the baby from drowning, even if it would mean that you destroy your Hermes blankets, which costed you $3,000 total? Well, most people would say, of course, you mess up the Hermes blankets in order to save the drowning child because this is consistent with your moral principles. But as a result, I think there is equally for many people no excuse for not saving as many lives as possible. So let's say it wasn't just one drowning child, but on your way home, there was a series of puddles of drowning children. You would feel just as morally obligated to save the 10th child drowning in that puddle as the first child. So yeah, for many people who find those arguments compelling, that's one reason to try to do the most good. I think also personally, that's not what motivates many people in the effective altruism movement. I think the most compelling reason to do the most good is because you want to. And this is certainly the case with myself and most people that I work with. So most people that I work with just have this compulsion where just as much as they want to eat chocolate, they want to make other people's lives better. And it might not be pure altruism. It might be that you just derive a ton of satisfaction from the knowledge that you've saved 20 lives this year or what have you. But I think that most aptly describes most people in the movement, that they just, from a sort of gut sense, feel that improving other people's lives or the lives of other sentients is the thing that would make them most personally fulfilled, or even if it wouldn't make them personally fulfilled, it's something they just really want. Yeah, I'd say those are the top three reasons. So evidence that that doing good makes you feel good. Evidence that doing the most good is consistent with most moral systems, and also that you want to do good. And if you want to do good, why not do the most good?
Fantastic. That's a really good rundown, actually. So now there's different approaches to doing good in the world, and we've spoken about how to give. And well, there's effective career choice, which can either affect how you give or the impact that your direct actions are doing. So yeah, do you want to talk about effective career choice then? And this is one of the things that people often bring up in relation to EA. So yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think let's see. I think I'm going to pick the 4 most counterintuitive things rather than the 4 most important things for career selection. And hopefully people watching this video will decide to learn more because these things are so interesting. Yes. So I think that the number 1 most important thing is something that I already mentioned, an extremely counterintuitive thing, which is cause selection. Most people think of how to do the most good within their cause. They try to find the most effective solutions. But it's like deeply counterintuitive for some reason to try to compare across causes. And like I said, it's much easier to save 1 billion lives if you choose the right cause than if you choose the wrong cause. So I think cause selection is number 1. Number 2 is the concept of replaceability. So let's imagine you walked outside and next to the drowning child, there is another person with 3 Hermes blankets that is closer to the drowning child than you are. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to rush behind this person, push them out of the way to prevent them saving the drowning child, to try to save the drowning child yourself. Most people would see that as either morally neutral, like net neutral, or net negative. Maybe because you made the other person feel bad for their
unless it was the only reason why you're trying to do good was to feel good.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. So if the only reason you're trying to do good is feel good, well, you would still have the knowledge if you know about the concept of replaceability and doing good makes you feel good. Then knowing that you wouldn't be doing good would make you feel ideally not good or even bad. So in this thought puzzle, the basic idea is that you're replaceable in saving that drowning child, right? If there's a different person who could do it more easily or is already on their way to do it, it doesn't really make sense to be the one to do it yourself. Although it may seem intuitive in this thought experiment, it's deeply unintuitive when you apply this approach to choosing a career in the real world. So, for example, lots of people I know who want to do lots of good will take as their first option something like becoming a doctor or working in a nonprofit or becoming a social worker. And while while certain instantiations of these careers might in fact cause quite an amount of good, the average doctor, social worker, or nonprofit worker is often replaceable. And so the idea there is, let's take being a doctor as an example. You have to compare the amount of lives you would save and improve relative to the person who would have gotten the position otherwise. So at least right now, there are more people graduating medical school than there are positions for doctors, at least in the first world. I'm not sure if this is as much the case in the third world. So you might be less replaceable going to the third world. But at least here in the United States, it would be the case that you're probably displacing the next best person by taking a position as a doctor. And that next person, if the difference between you and that next person is small in terms of the amount of lives you could have saved and improved, then you should probably think about working in a different profession, even if you previously have a lot of sunk costs in training to be a medical professional. In fact, there might be nearby things like global health and becoming a medical researcher that might be much higher impact, where you can easily transport the same skill set. And likewise, if you want to join a nonprofit, it is often the case that there are many more talented applicants for positions in nonprofits than there are actual positions. So even if you think you could do a lot of good yourself working at some nonprofit, it's likely not the case that you could have done orders of magnitude better than the next best person that would have been hired instead of you. Although I want to caveat this one in particular, because I think a lot of people inside effective altruism use this principle to do something called earn to give instead of contribute their talents. In many cases, this is a very good idea. So earning to give is the idea that you might be able to do more good by doing a career in something like finance or consulting, where you can make a lot of money and then donate that all back to charity. And the reasoning there is that there are very few people actually trying to do this in finance. And so the amount of bad that you would be doing compared to the next person to fill your position is relatively small. So you're not doing that much worse in the world, and you're doing much more good in the world by taking a high earning position. And so many people reason that they shouldn't take the position at the nonprofit when they could be doing something like earn to give, because they're less replaceable earning to give. But I think that logic is flawed if you're part of a movement or part of a network that is extremely talent constrained. So right now, it is the case in the effective altruism movement, for example, that we can't hire enough talented people at the organizations that we're trying to get people to work in. And so I think I see some cases of people who choose to earn to give, whereas instead they could have had maybe a more substantial impact working inside an effective altruism nonprofit or for-profit. But I think all else equal, you should keep replaceability in mind.
That's interesting. Cool. So one of the go on. I was just going to interject, and I was going to say So speaking to Stuart Armstrong, the problem is there that they have recently got quite a big donation at the Future of Humanity Institute there, so that they have enough money to continue operations. But yes, they need to find the right mathematicians at this stage. Is really what he was suggesting, and to get the people who are that skilled in the areas, in the specific areas in which they need people, it's really hard to find. So there might be plenty of smart people out there who just don't have the right background.
Exactly, and it is the same thing for us.
Yeah. So, if they could tempt Terence Tower over to Future of Humanity Institute with, a reasonably sized paycheck, as an example, that might actually have a big impact. But it remains to be seen whether, Terence would be able to transfer his specific, pretty darn good generally math skills to what they do there. Or he may not. He may just think it's just ridiculous.
Sure.
But
hopefully most people aren't motivated actually by most of the top people tend not to be motivated by money, in my experience. They're much more motivated by either doing an excellent job or by the impact that they can have, or the legacy that they can have. And while money might be a factor, it's almost certainly not the most important factor for many really talented people who want to work in top positions.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, well, that was basically what I wanted to say there. I didn't want to
Cool.
sort of rant too much, but so yeah, I interjected there, and I just didn't. I wanted to hear what you had to say.
Oh,
I think you
sure.
were finishing off saying something. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second to last one for career advice is, I think, maybe the most counterintuitive out of all of them. Um, Actually, do you mind if I grab some water really quick before I?
Yeah. Sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, you're back.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah. So yeah. Speaking to Stuart from Future of Humanity Institute viewers while we're waiting for Tyler to get a drink. Yes, they're currently looking for really good mathematicians, and if you know anybody who are one, it's definitely worth contacting them. So do it. Don't lurk. Let them know about your skill set and let them decide whether you've got the right skills. And there's no shame either way. So yeah, if you have got skills in mathematics, contact the Future of Humanity Institute or even other organisations like them. They need you.
Seconded.
Anyway, yeah.
I'm glad you put that plug instead of playing elevator music while I was gone. Far better choice.
That's right. All right. So yes, you were talking about this this next point that you had about earning to give.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the final one, which can correspond to earning to give, or a number of other careers, is the idea that you shouldn't always follow your passion.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this would have been super counterintuitive maybe in the 1950s or, like 50 or 60 years ago. But I think today it seems to be the case that the number one piece of career advice given by most people you talk to is to try to find the thing that you love and then try to exclusively pursue that thing. And I certainly used to be of this mindset as well. But there are a number of reasons why you should consider not following your passion. So reason number one is that we're really bad at predicting what will make us happy. So if you want to read more about this, check out the book, Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert. He just covers many, many cases in which people try to base their future on what will make them feel fulfilled and happy, and are really bad at doing so. And in most cases, pursuing your passion falls into this category, trying to a prediction that something will make you feel passionate when you do it, but then when you actually find yourself doing the activity, it's not as good as you thought in a professional context, or 3 years down the line, your passion runs out. And so that brings me to the second thing, which is that passions actually tend to be pretty fickle. And there's a lot of empirical evidence of this, but I think most people, if they reflect on their lives, will just find that their interests have massively changed over time. So in my case, I started out in communications design and graphic design and art, which is a surprising background for many people in effective altruism. But then after that, I moved to cognitive science and the philosophy of mind. And then after that, I moved to what I'm doing now, which is something like movement building. And each of these activities are drastically different. So, for the first one, I found myself in Photoshop 10 hours a day. For the second one, I found myself at a lab designing experiments 10 hours a day. And now I find myself doing a whole range of other things. Likewise, if you look at someone like Steve Jobs, do you by any chance know what his original passions were in college?
Drugs. I don't know.
Probably drugs.
Sex.
Sex and drugs, maybe some rock and roll.
I don't know. Yeah.
So maybe in addition to those, he was also very interested in history and dance. And so if Steve Jobs pursued his passion, the world would currently look really, really different. Or maybe it's just the case that his passion changed. I don't know. So if it is the case that passions are fickle, then you probably shouldn't use it as the primary criterion by which you choose a career. It might be important. You should probably factor in to which career you should choose, but it definitely shouldn't be the thing that is weighted most heavily. And so I think the thing that should be weighted most heavily, although I might be biased here, is that you should select a career based on how much meaning it will yield, and careers that yield a lot of meaning are careers that do a lot of good. So there's a lot of evidence that pursuing a career for meaning's sake will make you more sustainably fulfilled than pursuing a career for passion's sake. And so I think that's one pretty profound argument for choosing a career where you can be aware that you're saving and improving many, many, many lives.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So yeah, I found like there's been some literature or some psychology research which suggests that preferences don't necessarily predict happiness or well-being. Well, Peter Singer used to be a preference utilitarian, and I think on good grounds he moved away from that to, I guess, a more hedonistic sort of classic utilitarian framework for to support. Anyway, yeah. So
that's a great point. Yeah. So I think this is the reason a lot of people have moved away from like the basic version of preference utilitarianism. It's that people are really bad at choosing preferences. People often have the preferences for things that actually actively harmful are actively harmful for them. So you see this in the case of like drug addicts, and you see it in the case of myself in terms of eating too much chocolate, right? So if you asked me what I want right before this interview, when I was desiring chocolate, and you asked me what do you really want, I would have been like chocolate. But now my energy is kind of fluctuating because I ate too much chocolate.
I know the feeling. I do. Like I used to, me and a friend Craig, we used to do silly things. Just, I'd eat a whole 350-gram block of chocolate in one sitting. Right.
Bad idea.
that and drink a whole lot of alcohol and shout at the television with a friend. Yeah.
As one does.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't. I must admit, like maybe it's just my physiology is changing as well. But I think I've got like some good philosophical reasons not to do that, such as I don't want to be fat. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good philosophical reason.
Okay. All right. So yeah, and sorry, and you were going to say.
So the first three are in terms of choosing the right career. There's cause selection. There's paying attention to replaceability. There's being careful about following your passion and not using that as the main criterion. And then the final one, which I don't think is that unintuitive, unless you're on the outside of EA, is if you care about doing lots of good, you should probably try to join the EA network. And you should do that even if you're like pretty selfish, probably, but don't do it for that reason. And the reason I say that is if you look at the trajectory of the Effective Altruism Network, and it originally started as a bunch of philosophers huddled in small apartments. Indeed, I think the first Effective Altruism Summit was basically just held. It was like 60 people in a house.
Yeah.
And now you see things happening like Elon Musk of SpaceX and Jacqueline Fuller, the head of Google.org, doing things like speaking at the Effective Altruism global events. You have this incredible worldwide network of people in all different sorts of countries working in hedge funds and top consulting firms and graduating from Y Combinator and occupying top coder jobs. And then also you have this incredible and growing support network inside Effective Altruism. So you have Effective Altruism Ventures, which I run with a few other folks, which tries to give money to burgeoning projects in the Effective Altruism movement. You have an incredible network of donors where it's actually pretty easy to get something off the ground if you want to, or to sustain an organization. And then there are just people all over the world where you can like couch surf and hang out at their place and they'll feed you and stuff like that, even if it's not the most effective altruism thing to do. But it does seem like if you want to accomplish massive amounts of good, just for pure like career professional reasons, you might consider joining the Effective Altruism Network. And indeed, you actually see lots of people doing things that I wouldn't necessarily recommend, like dropping out of college, because they have made the prediction that by being inside the Effective Altruism Network, they can gain much more career capital than they would even by completing a 4-year degree. And I think the reason for that is inside EA, people generally trust one another's intentions. So there's not this sort of adversarial situation if you want to collaborate or hire with someone where you're really not sure what they're in it for. So you can better trust people's intentions, and also they'll much more accurately represent their skill level. So for example, you have this crazy phenomenon of people inside EA arguing themselves out of positions where they could be hired because they don't actually think they're as qualified as other people. I did this myself originally for CEA, and so it took me a while to get hired at the Center for Effective Altruism. And then you have this in a few other cases that I can think of people just turning down job offers because they don't think they're skilled enough. And so that also eliminates the adversarial situation where normally you're sitting across from an employer and you have to convince them that you're maybe much better than you are, and the employer is expecting that. So like all of which is to say that resume points don't really count as much, and a 4-year degree doesn't count as much, because there's this incredible support network of people who all sort of trust each other and represent who they are honestly. Yeah, so the final, I would say, career selection principle is to try to base your career with connections inside the Effective Altruism network.
Fantastic. So, okay, well, let's talk about the Effective Altruism Global thing that was going. Now, last year there was 3 conferences, sort of staged a little bit, like all around August and July and August, was it? Yeah. And one in San Francisco was in July, Melbourne mid-August, and then late August for Oxford, if I remember correctly. But they all went pretty well, and there's videos too. So yeah, what was I guess you had a big part to play in getting this off the ground, getting these conferences running, right?
Sure.
And so what was the reason, and what was the impact there? And
yeah, so the reason is that if you look at many impactful historical movements, you see you see that they grow quite substantially after they try to gather all their people in the same place. So this seemed to be the case, for example, for the Mont Pelerin Society, which was a gathering of people who are variously called free market economists or neoliberals, where once you brought all these incredible minds together, the sum of the whole was greater than the parts, which sounds kind of fuzzy. But I think there should be reason to suspect that this is the case. So, for example, it's really hard to strike up a working relationship with someone if you've never met them in person, because you don't have the signals that allow you to tell whether you're going to get along with them. Furthermore, meeting in person is much more high bandwidth in terms of communication than something like chat or writing or exchanging essays, where you can quickly respond to people's points and also gain much more information in a smaller amount of time. So I think that the main idea behind EA Global was, I mean, the reason anyone throws any conference, which is to try to put a bunch of people together so that they can accomplish amazing things together. But there were further pieces of our strategy besides just getting everyone together. And I think the most important one was trying to create the world's best intellectual community. And so encouraging norms of changing your mind. So I gave a talk at the various EA Globals about the virtue of changing your mind. And the reason for that is because if there's evidence that something is much higher impact than the thing that you're currently doing, you want to give yourself the affordance to change your career or change where you're sending your money. But then other intellectual norms, such as disagreeing with people gracefully, things like engaging in cause neutrality, so not favoring your cause over someone else's cause, except insofar as the evidence that it saves and improves more lives, and so forth. And I think these sorts of intellectual norms are going to be incredibly important for the Effective Altruism community's evolution, because once you cement these in place, you can have something like a thriving community that parallels the development of the scientific revolution. And so I think that probably the most important thing for Effective Altruism Global is doing something like trying to create the scientific revolution for the way that we do good. As for the tangible impact, I think it's really hard to say. And so this is something that, of course, the people working behind EA Global that keeps us up at night. And I think it's possible to do things like track whether people change their plan. So we did a bunch of that, and it did seem like many people change their plan in terms of what they're working on. It's possible to track numbers of like new people who self-identify as effective altruists because of coming to EA Global. It's possible to track how much money counterfactually went toward various causes because of the event of EA Global. And we did a bunch of these things, but I think ultimately that's not the metric we care about. And the metric we care about is something much less tangible, which is are people most effectively combining their resources to allocate them in the best ways. And so this might look like a bunch of people deciding to change their donation decisions, or it might look like new collaborations happening, or none of the above. And so basically, we're trying to create an environment where we have good arguments that a lot of these things can happen.
Yeah, fantastic. And so, like, now there's going to be a different sort of slightly different in structure way of doing the Effective Altruism Global conferences. Now, there's an EAGX brand out there now. And what's the difference there between EAGX and like the Effective Altruism Global?
Sure. So EAGX is basically the TEDx to Effective Altruism Global's TED, where the idea is to try to diversify the amount of people who are interacting with effective altruism by bringing people in from local cities where EAGX events take place, and then also allow individual effective altruists who are not affiliated with the Center for Effective Altruism to throw their own events and recruit awesome people to the movement. So basically, they're community-run events that function a lot like effective altruism, that are similar in style, that are presenting many of the same considerations, but it's happening in a much more distributed manner.
Fantastic. So now, how about other strategies for outreach then? We've spoken about conferences and such. Do you want to talk about other strategies like, having chapters, or like having sort of specific caucuses of people in political organizations that are talking to the right people? Anything that you think is worth discussing about outreach?
Sure. So the strategies that we're taking on are a small subset of, I think, the strategies that people should be carrying out, and that we would be carrying out if we had more person capacity. So the things that we're doing are the conferences, which I mentioned, EA Ventures, which is in a sense a sort of outreach vehicle, which is trying to encourage lots of people, reaching out and trying to encourage people to create projects that will then have a massive impact on the world, and then also bringing people into the effective altruism movement who previously hadn't been associated with it because there's like a golden apple over here, and then now that they find themselves surrounded by some of the smartest, most benevolent people in the world, decide to stay. Beyond that, there's a new initiative that a guy on our team called Peter Buckley is carrying out, and that initiative is EA Build, where the idea is that you have all these amazing chapters at some of the most elite universities in the world, like Harvard and Oxford and Stanford, and many of them have amazing strategies for scaling up, but no single one of them seems to have all the strategies that all the other ones have. So part of EA Build is interviewing every chapter head, finding out what works and what doesn't, and then trying to propagate the strategies that help small chapters raise the most money or recruit the most members and so forth. Furthermore, it's hopefully in the future a test bed for trying out what works. So since Effective Altruism, I think, has something like over 100 chapters, but maybe more accurately, like 50 very active chapters. It's like a pretty good sample size for trying out new things. So you could, for example, run an incredible sociological experiment where you have this randomized controlled trial of half of the 50 chapters, like half of the 50 most active chapters doing one intervention to, let's say, get the most giving what we can pledgers, like people who will donate 10% of their income to the most effective causes. And then the other half of people either not trying that intervention or trying something slightly different. And then you can see what works best. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a sort of science of movement building that's yet been developed. And so I think Effective Altruism Build is one of our highest potential projects for trying to figure out something like a science of movement building, which is I find incredibly exciting. And then beyond that, it's also just providing a lot of support for local chapters. So local chapter need money for pizza, and they need marketing help, and they need graphic design assistance, and our team can provide these things.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And then
you're going. I was going to move on to
talk about
Pareto Fellowship. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. So tell me about Pareto Fellowship and what's it all about? It's educational, but it seems also to a strategy to get people involved in highly effective startup culture. Is that correct?
Something similar to that. Yeah. Yeah. So the Pareto. Sure. Yeah, so the Pareto Fellowship is trying to tackle what most people see as the biggest bottleneck, either in effective altruism or in the world. Like if you talk to many venture capitalists, this will be the thing that keeps them up at night as well, which is trying to get enough talented people to do the most effective things. So I think in effective altruism, you have this unique problem where there are tons and tons of talented people peripherally involved, but they just haven't found the sort of tailored piece of advice or the tailored set of connections or funding or what have you to accomplish what they could. And so, especially at Effective Altruism Global, I was incredibly surprised by the amount of people I stumbled into where I wanted to like hire them on the spot, but previously they were virtually unknown to the rest of the community. And so I think there are lots of people like this where they do something like they read Will MacAskill's book on effective altruism, they surf the effective altruism websites, but all they encounter are a bunch of things that aren't tailored for them. And I think the Pareto Fellowship is going to be an attempt to match these sorts of people who are incredibly talented to training, to mentorship, to project incubation, funding, and anything else that they might need to carry out really epic projects. And the reason it's called the Pareto Fellowship is what I mentioned before, which is that in terms of the scale of various problems, they tend to follow something like a power law distribution. And one of the most famous power law distributions is called the Pareto distribution, where it's similar but not exactly the same as the Pareto principle. But for the purposes of this video, the idea behind the Pareto principle is that in one of these distributions, you often have a small set of the amount of things being responsible for the like by orders of magnitude the biggest effect. So this is the case with a lot of causes that an effective altruist might pursue. It's also the case with a lot of projects that an effective altruist might pursue. So if you look at projects like germ theory or the abolitionist movement or the eradication of smallpox, like these are examples that I think are symbolic of what is possible for individuals to try to accomplish. And so the idea behind the Pareto Fellowship is basically to try to match the most talented people in the world with the most important projects like that.
So when you said the abolitionist project, were you referring to David Pearce's the abolitionist project, similar to the hedonistic imperative, or something else?
I wasn't. I was thinking of the anti-slavery movement, but I think that is also an example of something in the same class. So certainly the idea that it might be well within our power and within our lifetimes to abolish suffering, that would seem to rank pretty high, if not one of the highest.
Yes, even if it is not in our lifetime, if you still value the quality of life of people, regardless of what time of history they're born, then, and obviously you can only really affect people today and in the future, then it makes sense to try and figure out philosophically, maybe at first, and then from a more scientific point of view and an engineering point of view, how to do that. So he's certainly explored some pretty interesting terrain there. So is there anything else? I think we've covered a lot here. It's been fantastic, but is there any points that I haven't covered, ask you about, that you'd like to cover then? At the end of the
I think that pretty much covers it. I guess if anybody has questions about either how to get involved or clarifying questions about any of the things we can talk about, they can feel free to email me. I'm pretty easily accessible.
Excellent. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you, Tyler, and you're doing wonderful things in the EA movement. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to maybe catching up with you sometime when like there's a conference on in Australia or San Francisco. Are you in Oxford or San Fran? I asked earlier, but
These days I'm in San Francisco.
yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks to you also for listening and watching. And yeah, I hope to speak to you again soon.
Cool. Thanks for taking the time.
Cheers.